Grew up on a farm near Newton, North Carolina. My dad had a sawmill, and so I grew up learning how to work hard. He had strong work ethics himself, and he instilled that in his children. And I've always been glad of that he taught me how to work and make your time useful, and just going at it from daylight to dark. And it was hard labor. That's exactly what it was, and it was something that I still cherish, although don't know if I'd want to go through it again or not, but still it was something that I appreciated. My dad took me to some races, dirt track races at North Wilkesboro and the old Charlotte Fairgrounds track in Charlotte, which was almost downtown then. It was on at the corner of Sugar Creek Road and South Tryon Street, wow. Or North Tryon Street, I'm sorry. And so we would go to a Saturday night race or Sunday afternoon race or something like that, because he was a fan, those 37 through 40 model Ford Coupes that they were racing back then.
And how old were you then? And
I was about 10, 11 years old. And they had a speedway in the early 50s. And it was a big thing in the community. You go down to the country store on a rainy day when you couldn't work at the sawmill or work on the farm, and those farmers and sawmillers would be sitting around there and said, "Boy, wait till they get that thing built." Said, "I'll go up there and show them how to drive." Well, secretly, I said, I'd try that. I like what I've been seeing, and started driving on the highway at a relatively young age. And my dad would let me drive to Sunday school when I was 9, 10 years old, and even though I had two brothers older than I, but he still trusted me, and or maybe I pestered him more. But anyway, he would let me drive, and that created a lot of interest in me as far as cars were concerned and driving, and having grown up around equipment, whether it was a truck or logging equipment. In fact, the first thing I ever drove in my life was a Rio truck, and most people don't even know what that was. And so anyway, when they started building that track, it just created a lot of interest in the community, because there were not many other forms of recreation or entertainment. A couple of movie theaters in town and high school sports, and that was about it, and there were not many high school sports. And so anyway, it worked out that the first race that was ever run at the Hickory Speedway was the first race that I drove in.
Wow.
And I had bought half interest in a car from a friend of mine by the name of John Lentz, and so it was just to have some fun on the weekend. And of course, my dad came to me after that first race, and he didn't like the idea of me driving race cars, because by then, see, I was 19 at this time. By then, the lumber business had expanded, because his two older sons, my older brothers, were out of school, and I had gotten out of school as well. But as soon as they got out of school, they went to work in the lumber business, and so he had bought a planing mill, and we were buying lumber off of other sawmills. And so I was the person who would count the lumber when it came in to the lumber yard, and I counted it when it went out. Make out invoices and basically do the bookwork for the company. He pointed out to me how important I was to the growing family business, and he just couldn't see where me participating with that group of people who drove race cars back then. Most of them were bootleggers, right. And others who were not bootleggers were considered just fools that didn't have any better sense to get out there and risk their necks. So he had worked awfully hard in the community to try to build respect, and that's one thing that he tried to instill into his children, was to build respect with your fellow man. And he couldn't see where me participating with that group could add too much to the image that he'd worked so hard to try to build. Understand where he was coming from as a dad. So I said, okay. I was only one race into it, so it wasn't that hard to walk away as a driver. And said, he said, it's okay to own half interest. He knew my interest in cars and knew I liked to work on them. And so we got my partner, he'd been a former motorcycle racer, and got him to drive the car then. And he did pretty good. Never did win. Well, he only ran it 6 or maybe 8 races. And then one night he got sick and didn't feel like driving, and we didn't look too hard for another driver. And we were both about the same size and both had big noses, and the infield was dark at Hickory Speedway, And so we went out into the infield and changed shirts, and we were wearing similar pants, khaki pants, and put the helmet on, came back out, and nobody knew the difference. So I drove the car and finished second. Now, he hadn't done that well, so we figured, well, I must be the best driver, so we got by with it that night, so we just keep it going. And then we lucked up and won a race, or outran them, whatever. Anyway, we won a race. And the word got back to a relatively small rural community. Word got back to my dad. And so he came to me. He said, okay, he said, if you're so determined to drive one of those things, he said, use your own name and get credit for any accomplishments that you may have along the way. So that opened the door for me then to go on and drive, and still just did it for a few years, just at Hickory, and occasionally a special event maybe at North Wilkesboro. That was in 1951 when it really started. In 1956, we had branched out to even more tracks into other states, into South Carolina and Virginia, and we're running a lot more races. And I found myself high in the national point standings for the sportsman division in '56, and the guy that would be racing against was Ralph Earnhardt. That year that he's going to try to go for the national championship. And so I thought, well, we're up there high enough. We was in the top 10. First time I saw the standings sometime up in the spring, and I said, we might as well just go and try to finish second. He was too far ahead of us to even challenge him. And so then we made the goal in 1957 to go for the championship, and we did. And but still was working at the lumber business this whole time. I mean, many nights we'd be away from home all night. For example, we'd race at Virginia Beach, Virginia on a Tuesday night, every Tuesday night. And we'd have to leave about noon. I'd get off at noon that day, and took us 7 hours to get there. And we'd get there in time to start practice at 7 o'clock, and then run the race, come back home, and it'd be about 7 the next morning before we get home. And I had to go back to work then. And so anyway, we did that for 2 years, going to that track. But anyway, we won the championship, and thought, well, after winning those 2 championships and those big races, people would come knocking on my door and want me to drive their Grand National car. It didn't work that way, though. I had to go knock on doors and beg for somebody to let me drive their car. And I started driving for a guy over in Kannapolis, North Carolina, in 1957 Chevrolet, which 57 Chevrolets were good race cars back then, but he didn't have the money really to buy the best parts and everything, and it was always breaking. It'd run fast, but something would always happen. And I was, towards the end of the season, I was getting pretty disgusted because I knew I wasn't doing my career any good, and so I said, I need to do something about this.